Burnt Toast!
Hi, everybody. Welcome to episode 7 of the Burnt Toast Show. I'm your host, Todd Harold. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed it so far.
What we're going to give you tonight, it'll be down to the nitty-gritty.
If you're following the playlist, you can get all that at the Burnt Toast Show YouTube site. You can check out all the playlists.
I think this is a crackpot idea.
So, like I say, we've got 7 of them now, and we've got lots more stuff coming for you.
The Burnt Toast Show.
Make sure that we acknowledge our sponsor. Right.
Hi, I'm Dr. John.
Premier Chiropractic, 7113 West Jefferson Boulevard, Fort Wayne, Indiana. An affordable walk-in clinic run by my dear friend, Mr. John McDonald. Dr. John McDonald. Dr. John, of course, would be the guy that would sponsor the Burnt Toast Show. Dr. John. Go see Dr. John.
Trained through the ICPA to specialize with prenatal and pediatrics, and I am Webster certified.
He's done so much for me, and I know he'll make you feel better. That's what he does, Dr. John.
Hi, I'm Dr. John.
Do you hear me, Kowalski?
Well, let's run down the playlist over here, this playlist. So we're going to start from the bottom and go backwards, because that's what we do. We did about an hour or so there. The last thing we heard was Terry Reid from his album called Seed of Memory. We heard the title track, 1976 album. Terry Reid was originally offered the vocalist position in Led Zeppelin before it was eventually given to Robert Plant. Jimmy Page offered Terry Reid that spot first. I'm not sure why he turned it down.
I'm afraid I can't do that.
Some really great albums in the early 70s. This was my favorite. It was his 4th LP, produced by Graham Nash, who does background vocals on it. That's a track called Seed of Memory, as I said, title track. Terry Reid on the guitar and the vocals, David Lindley on the slide guitar, Graham Nash on the harmony vocals, Tim Weisberg on the flute, Lee Miles on the bass, and James Gadsden on the drums. David Lindley, we know as a California session musician who worked a lot with Jackson Browne, most notably on Runnin' on Empty, all the violin and slide guitar stuff on there. That's very, very identifiable. He was very closely associated with Jackson Browne. He also played with Crosby and Nash, and I imagine that Nash hookup got him the spot on this song. Tim Weisberg was a great jazz flute player, a little bit more of a mainstream jazz flute player, who did an album in 1978 with Dan Fogelberg called Twin Sons of Different Mothers. That was very, very successful. That was sort of the height of his success. But that's Tim Weisberg on the flute, James Gadsden on the drums, who played on so many great soul records. Got to Be Real by Cheryl Lynn, Use Me by Bill Withers, some really great stuff. But anyway, James Gadsden there. So it's a varied lineup on that one. I like all the diversity that he brought together.
With more music and less Nessman.
Before that, we heard Miles Davis from what is widely regarded as the first fusion album, In a Silent Way. It was recorded in February, on one day, February 18th, 1969, released on July 30th, 1969. And that was a track called It's About That Time. Now, there was a lot going on. We got to talk about this a little bit. It's About That Time is the jumpiest track on there. The rest of it's kind of pastoral and sort of meditative, I think. But this track sort of had a lot of energy, especially during Miles' solo when Tony Williams, the drummer, kind of opens up. Miles Davis's quintet at that time was Miles Davis on the trumpet, Wayne Shorter on the saxophone, Chick Corea on the electric piano, Dave Holland on the bass, and Tony Williams on the drums. Miles augmented that group with extra people, which he was then known to do. He really liked having extra keyboard players, extra percussionists, all that stuff. That was really realized in his next album, Bitches Brew.
That's jazz.
But on this one, with Miles Davis on trumpet, Wayne Shorter on the soprano saxophone, Chick Corea, Dave Holland, and Tony Williams, he added Herbie Hancock on a second electric piano, Joseph Zawinul on the organ, and John McLaughlin on the guitar. So let's look at this. Okay, so Miles Davis, we think of him as the founder of fusion music, along with a lot of other things.
Do you know that if is the middle word in life?
If you look at Wayne Shorter and Joseph Zawinul, they started the band Weather Report within a few years. John McLaughlin was a member at that time of Tony Williams' Lifetime, which was one of the first fusion groups, and then formed the Mahavishnu Orchestra out of that, which was a very influential fusion band. And Chick Corea formed Return to Forever. Herbie Hancock formed the Headhunters. So that was pretty much the breadth of influential fusion music for the next probably between 6 and 10 years, I would say. He put them all on the same album. Pretty cool stuff there. Miles Davis, It's About That Time. Very memorable bass line on that one, too. I wonder if Dave Howland came up with that, or that was Miles or somebody else. Before that, we heard Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson from an album called The First Minute of a New Day that came out in January of 1975. It was Gil Scott-Heron's first album on a major label, that being Arista, Clive Davis's label. He had been unceremoniously dismissed from Columbia Records some years before and started his own label and was very successful for a long time. He started off with jazz people, the Brecker Brothers and the Headhunters and Gil Scott-Heron. And then it sort of became Melissa Manchester and Barry Manilow, and then later Whitney Houston and Kenny G. So it was kind of, okay, all right. But this was a track, my favorite Gil Scott-Heron track, my personal favorite, Winter in America, and It's Winter in America.
Stop torturing me, Ethel.
Gil Scott-Heron on the vocals and electric piano, Brian Jackson on the flutes and the keyboards, Danny Bowens on the bass, Bob Adams on the drums, keeping that march thing happening, and Barnett Williams on the percussion. Gil Scott-Heron and Brian Jackson, Winter in America. Before that, we heard the band The Rascals. They were originally called the Young Rascals, and there were 4 of them. 2 of them left, and Felix Cavalier on the vocals and the keyboards, and Dino Danelli on the drums decided to carry on and do a couple of jazz albums. This is from an album called, what we played on the playlist, is from an album called The Island of Real. It was their 9th and final LP, came out in 1972. Before this, they had done an album called Peaceful World that was along the same lines as well. They really wanted to stretch out. And if you check out what they were doing, they were working with jazz musicians, essentially, and there were only 2 of them that were really the band. Sounds like Steely Dan. So they were kind of Steely Dan before Steely Dan on those 2 LPs. Felix Cavalier, we heard a track called Buttercup, by the way. Felix Cavalier on the vocals and the keyboards, Dino Danelli on the drums. Those are the guys that were actually the Rascals. They were joined by Buzz Featon on the guitar. We played some of his stuff last week with his band Full Moon. He was very popular and very influential at that time. He also played on Stevie Wonder's song Superwoman on his Music of My Mind album that year. That's some great stuff there. Robert Popwell on the bass. Pops Popwell was his nickname. He later played bass with the Crusaders. Annie Sutton on the vocals. Hubert Laws and Joe Farrell on the flutes. And Manny Stamm on the flugelhorn. The Rascals with Buttercup. If you get a chance to check out Island of Real, worth your time. Before that, that band that I just mentioned, those 2 guys playing with jazz musicians, Steely Dan, from their album called Katie Lied from 1975, and that was a track called Dr. Wu. It was their first album where they sort of decided they didn't need a band. Denny Diaz, the original guitar player, was still on some tracks, but mostly it was Walter and Donald wrote the songs, Donald sang the songs, and then they just brought in different bands and whichever they liked best. This became a very expensive and exhaustive proposition after a while by the time that Asia and Gaucho happened.
You're stoned out of your mind, man.
They were looking for perfection, and maybe they achieved it, maybe not, but some great albums. Donald Fagen there on the vocals and the keyboards, Walter Becker on the bass. I'm guessing here. I'm trying to figure it out because it's just a big list of names. Jeff Porcaro on the drums. I know that is Jeff Porcaro. He was like 19 or 20. He had already toured with them. He'd also toured with Seals and Crofts and Sonny and Cher. And he was sort of this young wunderkind, the LA studio scene. And later he was one of the founding members of Toto. But he played on literally thousands of albums before he passed away in 1993. Michael Omartian on the piano, Hugh McCracken on the guitar, and Phil Woods on the alto saxophone. Phil Woods is an interesting choice. This was one of the first times that they actually used a high-profile jazz musician on one of their songs. Phil Woods came to prominence playing with Charles Mingus, and he had his own quartet that always got great reviews in every downbeat magazine in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he also played on Billy Joel's song, Just the Way You Are. A little more high-profile than this song, but this is the better solo, I think. But Phil Woods was on that song, did it in one take, from what I understand, and had no idea who Billy Joel was. So there you go, Steely Dan, Dr. Wu. Moving up the playlist, some Chick Corea. We talked about Chick Corea and Return to Forever when we talked about Miles. This is from a compilation called Return to the Seventh Galaxy, and that was a version of Spain that was originally on the Light as a Feather album, which I think was the debut, maybe, for Return to Forever, but I'm not sure. Maybe it was the second one. I think it was the second one, come to think of it. But this was recorded live at Quiet Village in Long Island in 1973 and broadcast live on the radio on WLIR FM. And it was a band that never recorded, other than that, as Return to Forever. Chick Corea on the electric piano and Stanley Clarke on the acoustic bass were both founding members and were there for the entire time. They were joined at that time by Bill Connors. Chick Corea was very influenced after the first couple of albums by the Mahavishnu Orchestra and decided that he needed to get a guitar player. And so he got Bill Connors. Bill Connors was there for a short time and then was replaced by Al Di Meola, but this is Bill Connors on this. And they were joined by Chick's friend from Rochester, Steve Gadd, on the drums, and Mingo Lewis, who we've talked about a lot on the show, on percussion. Steve Gadd decided that he just wanted to pursue his career as a session musician in New York, which worked out really well for him. And Mingo Lewis, I think, was collateral damage. I think that when Steve went, Mingo went too. I'm not sure how that worked, but Mingo didn't stay with the band either. They were collectively replaced by Lenny White on the drums, and that was a very successful band. Chick Corea returned to Forever with probably his best-known composition, Spain. Before that, we heard Joe Cocker from his debut album called With a Little Help from My Friends that came out in 1969, just before he played at Woodstock and did a very memorable performance of this song that was in the Woodstock movie. Joe Cocker on the vocals, Jimmy Page, just before he formed Led Zeppelin, on the guitar. Jimmy Page was a session musician before Led Zeppelin. Chris Stainton on the bass, Tommy Iyer on the organ, and B.J. Wilson from Procol Harum on the drums. Joe Cocker with a little help from my friends. Before that, we heard a great avant-garde soul artist that's been around for a while, named Van Hunt. And that was a single that was released in January of 2024 called Our Love Lingers. We heard the drummer Nate Smith on that one, and he also did the string arrangement, which was very cool. Great drummer Nate Smith. And that was Van Hunt on the vocals and all the other instruments. Van Hunt, Our Love Lingers. Some really cool and different stuff there. Before that, we heard Jean-Luc Ponty, the great French violinist, with the title track from his album called Cosmic Messenger from 1978. Jean-Luc Ponty came to people's attention he had been a big jazz star in France for a while, but he came to America. I'm not sure if he came to America, but he came to people's attention in the second version of the Mahavishnu Orchestra with John McLaughlin. And then after that, he played with Frank Zappa for a short time. On this song, Cosmic Messenger, that's Jean-Luc Ponty on the violin and the keyboards, Alan Zavad on the keyboards, Joaquin Lavano and Peter Maunu on the guitar, Ralph Armstrong on the bass, Casey Sherrill on the drums. Now let's talk about a couple of those folks. First off, Jean-Luc Ponty signed with Atlantic Records after leaving Zappa's employ and started to do some really great albums. There's a series of albums on Atlantic Records, including this one, that are all really great and really worth checking out. They do have a familiarity from album to album. He kind of had a formula that he worked out of. They're still really great. He wrote great melodies. The chords are great, and the soloists are fantastic. He worked with so many great players. But on this one, he's working with Ralph Armstrong, who was also in the second version of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and now, oddly enough, is in the house band every weekend at Baker's Keyboard Lounge in Detroit, Michigan. As I speak, that's true, okay? It's really cool that you can just walk into a bar in Baker's Keyboard Lounge in Detroit, and there's the guy from the Mahavishnu Orchestra and Jean-Luc Ponty playing bass, Ralph Armstrong. That's pretty cool. Casey Sherrill on the drums had played with Gino Vanelli. He's on an album called, is he on two? He's on the Pauper in Paradise album. Some really cool drums on that one. And now he's a professor at Berklee College of Music and teaches there. Jean-Luc Ponty with Cosmic Messenger, moving up the playlist. Lettuce from their album called Elevate from 2019, a feature there for Nigel Hall. That's Nigel's arrangement of Everybody Wants to Rule the World. I know it's Nigel's arrangement because I heard him do this with other bands before he joined Lettuce. Of course, that's the Tears for Fears song from the 1980s, Everybody Wants to Rule the World. Nigel Hall on the vocals and the keyboards, Adam Deitch on the drums, Adam Smirnoff on the guitar, Eric Coombs on the bass, Ryan Zoidis on the saxophone, and Benny Bloom on the trumpet. Lettuce, Everybody Wants to Rule the World. Before that, we heard something new from, I believe it's credited to Corey Fonville and Sam Freebush. Corey Fonville, the drummer from Butcher Brown. Sam Freebush, great organ player. But I could only find it credited to Corey Fonville. The album is called R&B Organ Trio, and it's brand new. This came out as of February of 2026. That's a track called Why Don't You? Corey Fonville on the drums, Sam Freebush on the organ, and Charlie Hunter, our friend Charlie Hunter, on the guitar. Just regular guitar this time, not the hybrid guitar where he plays bass and guitar at the same time. We started off with something even newer than that. Bruce Hornsby has an album called Indigo Park coming out in April of this year, and that was the title track, Indigo Park. Bruce Hornsby and the Noisemakers. He uses his own band. He can do that. Bruce Hornsby on the vocals and the piano, J.T. Thomas on the keyboards, J.V. Collier on the bass, Gib Droll on the guitar, John Mallender on the violin, and Chad Wright on the drums. Bruce Hornsby with Indigo Park. And that was the first set. Once again, I want to thank John McDonald for sponsoring the show at Premier Chiropractic, 3117 West Jefferson Boulevard, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Go in and get cracked.
No, that's wrong.
It's a highly specialized field.
Our second set is going to be side 2 of Little Feat, Waiting for Columbus. One of my all-time favorite albums. I recently started listening to this all the way through again. Sometimes, I first got this album, it came out in February of 1978. So if I bought it when it came out, which I probably did, because I was a huge fan of Time Loves a Hero, the album that before that. And I just compulsively bought albums at that time. I was probably 13. So it's really amazing that an album that meant so much to you at 13, I can listen to it now and still find things that are just stunning about it. One of the great albums of all time. As I talked about on the Donny Hathaway Live album feature, I put this up, this one and the Allman Brothers Live at Fillmore East. Put those up with Donny Hathaway as the greatest live albums of all time. And this might just be my favorite. On side 2, we've got 4 songs: Time Loves a Hero, Day or Night, Mercenary Territory, and Spanish Moon. The first 3 songs were recorded at the Rainbow Theatre in London, the first 2 on August 4th, 1977, and the third one, Mercenary Territory, on August 2nd, 1977. Spanish Moon was recorded at Lisner Auditorium in Washington, D.C. later in that week in 1977. And they were specifically recording these for an album. And wow, just incredible. Now there's stories about how a lot of the parts were replaced. In particular, there is no live Lowell George. The story is that there's no live Lowell George on this album. He overdubbed all of his vocals and all of his guitar playing. And his guitar playing and his vocals are pretty perfect if you listen to it. So maybe. I've heard that they also overdubbed a lot of other things, but I'd like to think that the rhythm section is live and that the horn section was live. I would love to think that those saxophone solos were actually happening at the time.
I think it would go something like this.
Lowell George on the vocals and the slide guitar. Paul Barrere on the vocals and guitar. Bill Payne, who still fronts this band, on the vocals and keyboards. Kenny Gradney, still with the band, on the bass. The unbelievable Richie Hayward on the drums and vocals. And Sam Clayton, who's still with the band, on percussion and vocals. They were joined by the Tower of Power horns, and this was a really great version of the Tower of Power horns. They went through a lot of changes. This is kind of the classic lineup. Emilio Castillo on the tenor saxophone, Steve Doc Kupka on the baritone saxophone, Greg Adams on the trumpet, Mick Gillette on the trombone and trumpet, and the unbelievable Lenny Pickett on the tenor saxophone. Lenny Pickett does a saxophone solo on Day or Night that's incredible, and then he does one of my all-time favorite saxophone solos of all time. It just, the way that they build the tension on Mercenary Territory in the solo section for that solo, and the way he ends the solo with the note just continuing to go up, I just think that's fantastic. I think it's this is really one of the great album sides of all time.
Is that
and
good?
I really hope that you enjoy it. Thanks for tuning in.
Give the best at which you feel you are capable.
Check this out. And stay with me, because we're going to do an album feature after the Little Feat.
Burnt Toast!
The Burnt Toast Show.